Hello, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Reading Little Blue Books Out Loud While Stoned. In this video, we're going to do the final chapter, Part 5, Chapter 5, of Little Blue Book number 1127, titled Christianity and Slavery, written by Joseph McCabe, copyright 1920s. So, where does Chapter 5 begin? Chapter 5 is the churches and the workers, and that begins on page 55. So let's get on back to page 55, shall we? Okay, there we are. Chapter 5, the churches and the workers. Back of all these quibbles and squabbles about Jesus and Paul, Gregory of Nicaea and Woolston, William Wilberforce, and Lloyd Garrison is a poignant and immense human tragedy. It is the larger part of the tragedy of human history which Winwood Reade called the martyrdom of man. It was bad enough in pagan days, but humanity in Europe was then young and had to learn wisdom. It was worse 1,000 years later, when 9/10 of Europe were serfs. It was still terrible at the beginning of the 19th century. In one of my most recent books, A Century of Stupendous Progress, I have shown that the workers of England 100 years ago worked, on the average, at least 14 hours a day, 6 days a week, for an average wage of certainly less than $3 a week. That most of the children of England over the age of 6, and many under it, of both sexes, worked 12 or 13 hours a day, 6 days a week, for about 2 cents a day. That the conditions of workshop and home were vile beyond description. That holidays were only 2 days a year besides Sundays. That food was dear and of the poorest description. And that manners were correspondingly brutal and morals rare. I proved this from contemporary documents that no one doubted. The British worker was then, it is true, in a slightly worse position than the American worker, but he was better off than any other worker in the world. I invite the reader to get that point clearly. In the year 1826, 9/10 of the men of Europe and a very high proportion of the women worked 90 hours a week in filthy conditions under brutal masters. For a little over $2.50 a week, they lived mainly on bread, potatoes, and water. Meat, milk, sugar, tea, and fruit they rarely tasted. Not 5 in 100 of them could read or write. Their amusements were of the coarsest description. Their sex morals were atrocious, yet they were no worse off than in previous centuries of the Christian era. Professor Howard Rogers' 6 Centuries of Work and Wages shows that for England, and Brissot's Histoire du Travail shows it for Europe generally, and at that time Christianity had dominated Europe for more than 1,000 years. There is the full irony of the Christian claim: it emancipated the slaves, you say. It did not. But in any case, it created the new slavery of serfdom, and later the martyrdom of the black race. It emancipated the serfs, you protest. It did not. But it witnessed the evolution of the serfs into these free workers of a century ago, brutalized by excessive labor, shut out from all knowledge, deprived of the least voice in the control of their own affairs. It is a mockery to talk about the social service of Christianity, to remind us how it taught the brotherhood of man. But we have to complete our study by finding who did help the workers of the world to reach a higher level. In the first place, the Reformation did nothing for them. There had already begun a movement in the life of Europe, a movement quite distinct from Christianity and hostile to it, which was the first flush of a new dawn upon the Dark Ages. The Moors of Spain had given Christendom an object lesson in civilization. The humanist of the Renaissance conjured up before it long buried civilizations of Greek and Rome. But the Reformation, necessary and important as it was a reaction both in culture and social idealism. Luther and his colleagues primarily sought to concentrate the attention of men on the Bible and on their immortal souls. You're proud of it? Very good. But you cannot have your bread buttered on both sides. The more a man cares for an immortal soul, the less he cares about our mortal bodies. At first, Luther showed a human concern about the exploitation of the mass of the people. A German noble had said contemptuously of the German peasants, then the great majority of the nation, "They will never rise unless you cut a slice off their buttocks." To put it as politely as possible, they rose, however, and they claimed Luther's sympathy. After some hesitation, he harshly condemned the insurrection. He discovered that the Bible ordered them to be subject to all higher authorities. In July 1624, he wrote to the nobles of Saxony, "They must be crushed." So much for that Christian love, huh? They must be crushed, strangled, and spitted wherever it is possible, because a mad dog has to be killed. He defended serfdom, saying that to abolish it would be against the Gospels and robbery. In later years, he wrote, "All their blood is on my head, but I leave it to the Lord God who bade me speak thus." Melanchthon was no better. He said, "The Germans are always such ill-bred, perverse, bloodthirsty folk that they must be kept down more stringently than ever." Eckartus, in his Gestalt des Neerden Volks, in German, I completely butchered, my apologies, is quite candid about the kind of brotherhood which the great reformers learned from their profound study of the Gospels. If any change is claimed by any historian of labor, it is that during the 3 centuries after the Reformation, the condition of the workers grew steadily worse. Let not the Catholic rejoice, however. It was just the same in Catholic and Protestant lands, as Brissot shows in his Histoire du Travail. There were economic causes of this which we cannot discuss here. As to religion, we have only to say that bishops and priests continued their absolute and universal indifference to the martyrdom of the mass of the race. Strong language? Name, if you can, one who acted otherwise. The first attempt at reforms was made by the French Revolution. This at once conjures up visions of bloodshed and orgies in the minds of religious readers who read about it only in religious works, hear about it in sermons, and see it on the screen. I'm going to devote a book to it later and show that the horrors were mainly due to the later revolutionaries, and that the first half of the French Revolution was a sober and beneficent movement led almost entirely by rationalists. The way had been prepared for its best work by the great rationalist or encyclopedist of the 18th century. Voltaire had been concerned mainly with superstition, though he has a fine record of humanitarian service, but the later and more radical unbelievers just before the Revolution were strong humanitarians. And they were all what we now call agnostics or materialists. The early leaders of the Revolution, Mirabeau, Talleyrand, Sieyès, Lafayette, Desmoulins, Monnet, Danton, Pétion, and Barnave merely developed their ideas. And all these men, in turn, were either deists or agnostics. A Christian like the Abbé Gregory was a very rare bird amongst the Aries, and he was revolutionaries, and he was angrily disowned by the church. Again, let me ask the religious reader to look at this broad and uncontroverted situation frankly. The millions of workers of France were in a lamentable plight. 20 million people lived on the land, owned only 2/5 of it, and bore an intolerable burden of taxes for church and state. 200,000 priests, monks, and nuns owned a fifth of the land and paid no taxes. Yet all these exponents of the gospel had for ages ignored the condition of the people and the gross injustice of their rulers, and only a few of the common clergy, sons of the people themselves, joined in the sound part of the revolution. There was a handful of skeptics, of atheists, and materialists. Turning to the page. And materialists and Voltaireans who gave the world the creed of the rights of man. Remember this the next time you hear an eloquent sermon on the horrible possibilities of materialism. Remember, too, that the Stoics, the only previous body of idealists who had moved the world, were materialists. The work of the revolution was murdered. Church and royalty combined to put their white hands round the neck of humanity. America, fortunately, had won independence of Europe, and the reaction did not spread to the United States. But the White Terror, ironically calling itself the Holy Alliance, spread over the whole of Europe. The workers sank back into the dark and sullen attitude from which the clarion call of the revolution had momentarily raised them. Not a priest or minister of the gospel in the world pleaded for them. Remember that also when next you are invited to compare the fruits of Christianity and materialism. In the recent work of mine, to which I have referred, A Century of Stupendous Progress, I have proved that the world has made more progress in the last 100 years, economically, socially, morally, and intellectually, than in the previous 1400 years of Christian power. One of the most distinguished living British economists, Sir Joseph Stamp, says that the British worker of today is 4 times as well off as the worker of a century ago. I have proved that this is true in every respect, and it is true of civilization generally. Who did it? If we were to argue in the manner of religious writers, the answer would be prompt and simple. Skepticism, of course. The new force in the world was rationalism. Christianity had been tried for 14 centuries and had failed dismally. The only thing that I can imagine any sincere and informed person saying for it is that it saved the souls of a large number of men. He could not even say that it improved the morals of Europe. Well, we have much doubt today, even about the saving of souls, but assuredly it did not save bodies. Then rationalism appeared, and the world leaped onward and made far more progress in a century than it had done in 14 centuries. But the little blue books do not follow the clerical standard of argumentation. We must analyze patiently, and it becomes at once apparent that science did most of the work. I should scarcely have the patience to discuss here the opinion of any man who claimed that the church gave the world science, so we will leave it to that the extraordinary increase of wealth and comfort was due to secular science. We have, however, to inquire how it was that the workers and the small middle class secured so much from this new wealth. As I have shown in my book, science has nothing to say to the distribution of wealth. Hydrate. Pardon me. Next, education was the great redeeming force. I devoted a special book, The Church and the Schools, Little Blue Book number 1128, which will be the next book coming up, to the question of education. So I dismiss it here with the anticipatory declaration, which will be proved beyond the shadow of a doubt, that education was won for the mass of the people mainly by rationalism, in spite of the churches. In short, the real question from our present point of view is, in what proportion were the social idealists who got these new forces applied to the uplifting of the workers Christians, and in what proportion were they non-Christian or anti-Christian? And please remember the perspective of the question. At the end of the 18th century, perhaps 5% of the world was rationalist and 95% Christian. In the hard period from 1820 to 1840, when the work entailed heavy sacrifices, perhaps 10% of Europe was rationalist and 90% Christian. From 1840 to 1880, still a desperate period for idealists, the Christians were at least in the majority of 70 or 80%. In our time, they are, taking one advanced country with another, in a minority of 30 to 40%. And the historical facts show that of these social idealists with whom I am here concerned, not mere philanthropists like Howard or Elizabeth Fry, or workers in a very narrow field like Shaftesbury, but men and women who fought for the betterment of the workers as a mass. The overwhelming majority were rationalists at a time when rationalists were only 5 or 10% of the whole community. That the great majority were still rationalists in the second half of the 19th century, and that is only in recent times, when reform movements were successful and the churches were losing members very heavily, that we have discovered such a thing as social idealism and social experts in the Christian bodies. For England, I have shown that in the first period, the men and women of the most influence were Paine, Byron, Shelley, Priestley, Horne, Tooke, Erasmus, Darwin, Goodwin, Hardy, Holcraft, and Mary Wollstonecraft. Hardy's opinion about religion is not recorded. Priestley was a Unitarian, which was not then regarded as Christian. Not one of the others was a Christian. The reaction against the French Revolution hardened the churches in their attitude toward reform. The bishops of the English Church opposed all reform. Lord Brougham, noticing that they avoided supporting even a temperance bill, said fierily that only 2 out of 6 in 20 right reverend prelates will sacrifice their dinner and their regard for their belly to attend and vote. Lord Shaftesbury angrily described the clergy, and he was a bigoted Christian, as timid, time-serving, and great worshippers of wealth and power. I can, he said, scarcely remember an instance in which a clergyman had been found to maintain the cause of laborers in the face of pew holders. I take the quotation from the Bishops as Legislators by Joseph Clayton, a devout member of the Church of England, and his book is a scorching indictment of his church. He praises Shaftesbury at least, but Shaftesbury opposed every reform movement except his own in favor of children, and he was so hated by the workers of London that he had to barricade his house against them. In short, one Wesleyan clergyman, Stephens, and later in the 19th century, one Anglican clergyman, Kingsley, worked for reform, and their churches persecuted them. This is the record for more than half a century. I have in my church and the people given the full evidence for my statements. When reform was arduous, very few Christian laymen figured in it. They and their clergy swarmed into it when it became successful, and the workers were deserting the churches in millions. All over Europe, there was not the same battle to fight in the United States. The great fighters were anti-Christian in the overwhelming majority. As to the papacy, which now says flattering things to the workers of America, the kind of thing a young man says to a young lady who has inherited a fortune. It has the blackest record of any section of Christendom. It murdered, as long as the world would allow it, those who fought for the rights of man. So had Christianity done from the first. The present-day claims of its apologists are like a row of haggard women whom you place on painted and on powdered under the blaze of our modern arc lamps. There you go. That is the end of chapter 5, the final chapter of Little Blue Book number 1127, titled Christianity and Slavery, written by Joseph McCabe, published by, and here's the back, the E. Hadewin Julius Publishing Company of Garrard, Kansas. Thanks for listening, and join me in the next Little Blue Book.